This lecture is about estate planning. Estate planning is the financial and legal arrangements that you make in case you die or become incapacitated. In other words, it's how you take care of yourself and the people and things that you leave behind if you're not able to communicate your own wishes. And estate planning is extremely important, as we're going to talk about in this lecture. The recent evidence shows that only 40% of Americans actually have any kind of estate plan in place. So why is this? If it's so important, why don't people do it? There's a few reasons why. First, they don't see the need. They say, I'm not rich, estate planning is for rich people, so there's no problem. I'm not going to die anytime soon, I'm young, so I'm not going to die, I'm not going to do it. People assume it's going to be very expensive. You need a lawyer for an estate plan, and they assume that's expensive. They don't want to take the time to do it. It can be difficult, it can be complicated. It doesn't have to be, but it seems like it's too hard and too difficult. But the biggest one is that it's just too depressing to think about your own death. We don't like to think about dying. And we naturally steer away from thinking about death. And so in order for us to build an estate plan, we actually have to sit down and force ourselves to face the reality of our own death. And that's just not any fun. People don't like to do that. All of these reasons get in the way of forming an estate plan. But why is this so important? What would happen if you died or became incapacitated and you did not have an estate plan? The distribution of your estate would be decided by state law. In many cases, this works out okay. But in many cases, it doesn't. So what might happen if state law decides what happens to your estate instead of you deciding through your estate plan? Well, you don't get to decide who gets your stuff or when they get your stuff. For example, you may have a classic car that you really love and that your brother really loves, and you would like him to have it if you die. But if you die without a will, then state law may say, you know what, we're going to give that to your mom. She's your closest living relative, so we're going to give the car to your mom. Your mom doesn't appreciate it, she doesn't want it, but she winds up with it anyway. Now, she can give it to your brother afterwards, but that requires paperwork and can be a hassle in and of itself. How about when people get your stuff? I just want my kids to get all the money I leave behind. Yeah, that makes sense, but what if they give them all that money the day that you die and your kids are 13? You want to give control of $200,000, $300,000 to a 13-year-old? That's probably not a great idea. You probably want to set something up to protect the money until they've gotten a little older and are better able to use that money effectively. So that may be important. Speaking of the kids, who gets the kids? Who's going to be their guardian? Who's going to raise them? If you don't have an estate plan that specifies who's going to take care of your kids, then state law will decide. And it varies by state, but they have an order. They may say, okay, a surviving spouse is first, and then maybe the mother's parents are next, and then the father's parents, and then uncles, and so on. So they'll have a hierarchy of orders they'll go through. While this probably works okay in some circumstances, it works very badly in others. Let's say you don't get along with your mom, or you don't think she's a good influence. You don't want her raising your kids. But she may get the kids anyway because state law says she's the nearest living relative. Or maybe they'll go to your brother, but you hate your brother. He's a deadbeat. You don't want him teaching your kids. You don't want him raising your kids. But he may wind up raising your kids anyway. That's what happens to your kids if you don't do an estate plan. And yet sometimes it works out. A lot of people really love their mom or their brother and have no problem with them raising their kids. But unless you know what the state law is and who exactly will get your kids, it's better just to take control of that and build an estate plan that says, this is who I want to raise my kids. That way it's clear, and what you want to happen, happens. What happens to me if I'm unconscious? If you're in a coma, who decides to pull the plug? Should they pull the plug? Should they try treatment A or treatment B? How expensive are treatment A or treatment B? Would you want your family to incur that much expense when there's only a 2% chance that it will save you? What if there's a 20% chance? How much money are you willing to have your family spend in order to keep you alive? This is important because people think estate planning is about money, but it's really not. That's part of it. but it's also about the people. So if you don't care about what happens to your money, if you don't care about what happens to your kids, if you don't care about what happens to you, then you don't need an estate plan. But I'm willing to bet that pretty much everyone cares about at least one of these things. And that means that everyone needs an estate plan. Even if it's just a simple will that outlines a few things that you'd like to happen. If you don't have an estate plan, your family winds up having to make a lot of decisions for you. This is particularly important, like say you're in a bad car accident and you're unconscious and the doctors are saying you don't have a good chance of living. Who decides if you live? Who decides whether to try to save you or how hard to try to save you? If you don't have an estate plan in place, you're forcing your family, who are experiencing emotional trauma, you're going to force them to make very difficult decisions. I know my mom, if I were in a coma and she had to decide whether or not to pull life support, and she decided to pull life support, I know that my own mother would never, ever forgive herself. Even if that was the only reasonable option, even if it's the correct option, she would feel terrible about that forever. She would feel like maybe she should have tried harder, maybe she could have done more. I don't want to put that burden on her. I don't want to put that burden on my wife. I don't want to put that burden on my kids. I'm going to take that burden on myself so that if something happens to me, that's one less thing they have to worry about. That's what estate planning is about. It's about the family, then the people that you leave behind. There are 4 basic components you should have in your estate plan. First, you need a living will. A living will just says, here's what I would like you to do to keep me alive. That's where you would say, I want CPR and chemotherapy, but I do not want brain surgery or heart surgery. So you can go through and list, these are the things that I'm willing to have you do to save me. If you have to do these things to save me, then don't bother. They basically just list out under what circumstances you would like to try to be resuscitated and under what circumstances you would prefer to just be let go. Now this is different from a medical power of attorney. Medical power of attorney is where you specify a person to make medical decisions for you. So if you pick someone and you give them medical power of attorney, they're going to be the ones that the doctors go to and say, we don't think they're going to make it, but we can keep them alive on life support and keep trying. What should we do? They're going to make that final decision. The reason this is different from a living will is that a lot of times a living will doesn't cover everything. It usually only lists basic things that you would like done and things you would like not to be done. But reality is often not that simple. And so a medical power of attorney just says this person will decide. And that way people don't have to fight or decide who's going to make this decision, right? That person has the power to make that decision. Now, if you have a living will and a medical power of attorney, that's really helpful because the person you give medical power of attorney can use the living will to guide their instructions. And so it's a very different thing to say, I pulled life support from my brother. I'm the one who made that decision. That's very different than saying, my sister's living will says she does not want this done. This procedure that we would need to try to save her is very similar. I don't think she would want it done, so we're not going to do it. So having both kind of covers you in all circumstances and helps take some of the emotional burden off the person that you give medical power of attorney to. Durable power of attorney gives someone financial control. So if you're incapacitated, the person with durable power of attorney becomes capable of using your money to pay your bills for you. I'll give you an example of this being helpful. I had a student in a class once whose mother was in a car accident, and she was in a coma for about 4 months, the entire semester. And she had no estate plan in place of any kind. No will, no medical power of attorney, no durable power of attorney, no living will, nothing. And her son was her only living family member. It was just her and him. She came within a couple of days of getting evicted from her apartment while she was lying in the hospital in a coma. Because she wasn't paying her rent, right? Because she can't, because she's in a coma. So this student of mine had to drive back and forth between her house and the courthouse, trying to get access to her accounts so he could pay her medical bills, pay her rent, keep the utilities going, so that when she came out of her coma, she would have a place to live and her finances wouldn't be completely wrecked. He finally did get that power, but he spent a month and a half going to his mom's house and back to the courthouse. And he was a long ways away. He had to drive 5 hours west to get to his mom's house from school. And then from his mom's house, the state courthouse was in another state, and it was 10 hours the other direction. So he had this huge drive. He lived in the middle. His mom was 5 hours to the west, the courthouse was 5 hours to the east, and he spent his whole semester running around trying desperately to get access to her accounts so he could pay her rent so she had somewhere to go home to. Is that what he wants to be doing when his mom's in the hospital? No, he wants to be there with her, doesn't he? He wants to take care of her, he wants to be able to support her, and he's still trying to get through school. A little estate planning would have prevented a lot of heartache for that family and a lot of stress. The last thing that you need is a will, and this is the document that states what you would like to happen with your possessions and your children should you die. It doesn't have to be complicated. For most people, this can be done pretty cheaply. You can go out, you can get the documents, you can have them signed, notarized, and it will hold up pretty solid. It's when you get a little older and things get a little more complicated that you may need help. So when should I hire a professional? When does it become important to do that? If you feel uncomfortable, you're just like, I don't think I understand this well enough to do it well. If you're really just not uncomfortable, go get some help. It really is not very expensive. When your estate becomes complicated, there's a number of things that can make it complicated. Having lots of assets, being wealthy, that definitely adds a lot of complication. You need a professional there. If you have a child with disabilities, you need to get a specialist in special needs trusts because many of these trusts are set up improperly. And if you don't take care of the disabled child right, you can actually cause some significant financial harm to them long run. After you die, this child's going to need support, and it costs a lot of money to support them. Make sure you get professional help for that. If you have multiple marriages, and particularly if there are children between those multiple marriages, definitely hire a professional to help you out. You're probably going to need a lawyer. You may want to get a financial planner. It can be very helpful to get both. Have one of each because they each bring a different perspective and skill set to help you out. But an estate plan is really important because it takes care of the people that you leave behind. Take the burden on yourself. Plan out what needs to be done. Make it so that if something terrible does happen to you, that your family has one less source of stress in their life. Do that by setting up your estate plan and getting professional help for it if you need it.